Do you know the Bill of Rights? The Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments to our US Constitution. Amendments are addition to, added on. So these are the first 10 amendments that have been added on to the US Constitution. And they were added on so that states would approve the Constitution. These 10 amendments guarantee some of our most basic individual freedoms that we have in the United States as citizens. And it was important for states at the time to secure those freedoms before they approved the Constitution that we have today. So you may know the First Amendment, freedom of religion is part of it. This is something important to Americans because the people who came to the new land, a lot of them came because they were persecuted for their religious beliefs. So they wanted to make sure that religious freedom was protected. And they do this with two clauses. Establishment clause, which basically says the government and religion have to be separate. There can't be a government religion that is sponsored by the government. They can't establish that. And the other clause is free exercise clause, where we can exercise or practice the religion we like without government interference, as long as we're not doing anything wrong or hurting anyone. So that is our religious freedom. Also part of the First Amendment is the freedom of press. And it's not just writing and having something published and sharing our views, but it's being able to read what other people write and share with us. Also, a part of the First Amendment is the right to assemble together, to assemble with like-minded individuals. And even if that means in protest against the government, that we have the right to do that. You can see other countries where they suppress this. And this was added to the Constitution because the British were suppressing that freedom as well. They were making people, they weren't allowed to gather together because they were trying to stop rebellion from happening. And also the freedom of petition. We have the right to complain and air our grievances to the government and say that we don't agree with something. And again, that's because they had so many grievances with Great Britain and Great Britain wasn't hearing it. So they wanted to include that as well. And of course, we all know the First Amendment is the freedom of speech. That is what provides us with freedom of speech, that we can speak our mind, we can disagree, we can say things that people may not like because we have that freedom of speech. Now, our rights and our freedoms are limited. The Supreme Court ruled in 1919 that freedom of speech could be restricted if it endangers people. And why is that? That is because we have these most fundamental rights, even before the amendments. We have life, we have liberty, and we have property. And if we harm that of someone else or endanger that for someone else, then we are held liable. So if we go into a theater and we know that the theater, there's no fire, but we yell fire and people running out of the theater panicking and they fall on top of each other and break their arm and leg and really hurt themselves, they can sue us, right? Because we said something that endangered their well-being, and that is illegal. That in that case, freedom of speech does not apply. So these are our First Amendment rights, some of our most fundamental freedoms as individuals here in the United States as citizens. The Second Amendment. A lot of us know the Second Amendment because it's always in the news, and that is the right to have and bear arms, and that is weapons or guns. And the reason for that, for being placed in the Constitution, was that they wanted to make sure that we were able, if needed, to be called up and protect our country, to protect it from foreign invaders, almost as a militia. Nowadays, we have militias. Every state has a National Guard, and that is the form of militia that every state has currently. So, but we still have the Second Amendment that does guarantee us to be able to bear arms and protect ourselves. The Third Amendment is to have the right not to have troops in our homes. So during the time that we were occupied, that we were the British colonies, the British had us quarter soldiers in our home. We had to feed them and give them shelter, or we had to pay money for them to go have shelter somewhere else and be fed. But it was a big burden on people and their families, and they wanted to make sure and make it very clear that we did not have to do that, that our home was protected from that. So that is why we have the Third Amendment. And this is the Second and Third Amendment to the US Constitution. Then we have our Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments. These amendments really help and protect us when it comes to being charged with a crime, law enforcement, and a court system. So the Fourth Amendment says, you know what, you cannot improperly search my belongings or me. You need to have a warrant. It has to be signed by a judge. And if you do not have a warrant and you find evidence, you cannot use that in the court of law. So even back then, they were having the same issues we have today with people abusing powers and trying to frame people for maybe something they didn't do. So the Fourth Amendment protects us from them just burging into our home and taking what they want as evidence. And that is mainly the Fourth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment comes along as well and protects us when it comes to double jeopardy. We cannot be tried twice for a crime. If I was tried and I already served my time, it's done. I cannot go back into court and have to be faced with those same charges. Self-incrimination, again, the same issues we have today, they had back then. So the issue of where they would kind of force you to admit to something that perhaps you didn't do. That's why we can now plead the Fifth. It comes from the Fifth Amendment. We can say nothing. We do not have to incriminate ourselves. And we don't have to feel pressured to say something that may or may not be true. Also, the Fifth Amendment gives us the right to due process, and due process is those legal proceedings that take us throughout the court system and to have our trial and our day in court. The Sixth Amendment helps us and protects us when it comes to being charged with a crime. Yes, I'm charged with a crime, but I still have rights. I have a right to a speedy trial. I don't have to sit around and wait for my trial to happen if it ever does, because we do hear of that in other countries where someone's been sitting in jail for 8 years to see their day in court. So we have the right to a speedy trial. We have right for legal representation. That's why if we can't afford one, one is provided for us. And we also have the right to be informed of why we're even being arrested in the first place. Why are you arresting me? What charges are you bringing towards me? I have that right. So Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments, super important to us, super relevant today as it was back then as well. Now we have our Seventh and Eighth Amendments. Our Seventh Amendment just says we have a right to trial by jury for civil law disputes just as well as criminal law disputes. And civil law disputes are more where it's contract issues or more disputes among individuals instead of criminal aspects. Now, the Eighth Amendment is going to deal again with the court system that if we are charged with a crime, we do have freedom until proven guilty. We are innocent until we've had our day in court and our jury of our peers decides that we are guilty. And that's why we have a system of bail. The Eighth Amendment establishes that system. And that is money that we deposit with the court for temporary release until our court date, so that we do have that freedom until proven guilty. So Eighth Amendment also includes no excessive fines. If we are found guilty, there should be no excessive fines. So if we're jaywalking, we cannot be handed a $50,000 fine. So no excessive fines and no cruel and unusual punishments. So that has been interpreted in the court of law for years and years because we have the death penalty in some states. So is the death penalty cruel and unusual punishment? And this is, of course, very subjective. It depends on who you ask and what their views on cruel and unusual is. So again, these are issues, things that secure and help our freedoms and things that are still debated on today. And then we have the Ninth Amendment. A Ninth Amendment provides us implied liberties. So just because it's not written in ink in the Constitution doesn't mean that that's not a right or liberty of ours as citizens of the United States. Just for being a citizen, we have implied rights and implied liberties, and that is provided to us in the Ninth Amendment. The 10th Amendment gives states powers. Remember, at the time, people were very fearful of having this federal government that's too powerful, kind of like the British were. So they wanted to make sure that states also retained power as well. And the 10th Amendment says whatever powers are not exclusively given to the federal government and rights to the federal government, or which ones are not specifically taken away from the states have. So the states kind of have whatever's left would be the states' powers. And that has been a way to be able to balance the powers between the federal governments and the state governments. And that's because of the 10th Amendment. That is your Bill of Rights. It is important to know your rights because that way it is less likely that they will be abused or taken advantage of.